Welcome back to Explaining Everything, the channel where we dive into the stories and mysteries behind everyday things. Today's question comes from one of our awesome viewers, History Buff 92. Thanks for the suggestion. You asked, when did pens replace feathers for writing? And honestly, solid question. Because at some point in history, humans collectively looked at a goose feather and said, "You've served us well, bird." But we're moving on. So how did we go from writing with bird parts to slick metal-tipped pens and those 3 for 10 pesos ballpoints you borrow from the bank? Today, we're cracking open the surprisingly dramatic history of writing tools, from quills to fountain pens to the mighty Bic. Get ready for a wild, inky ride, right here on Explaining Everything. Let's start with the quill, the OG feather pen. If you lived in Europe any time between the 6th and 19th centuries and had something important to write down, odds are you were doing it with a feather from a goose, swan, or turkey. Why? Because their feathers are strong, flexible, and apparently excellent at holding ink, which makes you wonder, who figured that out? Did someone just stab a bird feather into ink and go, "Yeah, this is the future"? Quills worked by taking advantage of the feather's hollow shaft, which could hold a small amount of ink. You dip it, write a few fancy-looking words, and then dip it again. It was elegant and wildly inconvenient. The tips would wear out quickly, so you had to sharpen them constantly with a tiny knife. There was even a job back in the day called a pen cutter. That's right, people were paid to sharpen feathers. We were a weird species, but despite all the maintenance, quills dominated for over 1,000 years. They helped draft the Magna Carta, the U.S. Constitution, and probably the first ever "Do you like me?" yes or no notes passed in medieval classrooms. Enter the metal pen. Now, to be fair, metal nibs weren't a new idea. The ancient Romans were already using metal styluses for writing on wax tablets, because nothing says permanent record like stabbing your homework into a slab of wax. However, it wasn't until the early 1800s in Birmingham, England, that metal nibs got their big break. This was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when everything was getting mass-produced, including the very tools we use to write angry letters and heartfelt poems. English inventors figured out how to make steel nibs in bulk, and suddenly you didn't have to pluck a goose to write your grocery list. These metal nibs were sturdier, lasted longer, and didn't need constant sharpening. By the mid-19th century, metal dip pens were basically everywhere. Schools, offices, and homes started ditching their feathered friends in favor of cold, hard steel. And honestly, it's hard to blame them. Still, metal pens had one thing in common with quills. They needed an inkwell. So you'd still be dipping every couple of sentences like some kind of ink-obsessed woodpecker. Enter the fountain pen. Early versions of the fountain pen actually date back to the 1600s, but they had issues. And by issues, I mean they leaked everywhere, like ruin your clothes and your day levels of leaking. Then, in 1884, a guy named Lewis Waterman came along and said, "Let's fix this mess." He invented a capillary feed system that allowed ink to flow smoothly without turning your pocket into an abstract ink blot test. Waterman's pen was reliable, elegant, and practical. So much so that by the late 19th century, fountain pens were the go-to writing tool for professionals, students, and anyone who wanted to avoid looking like they just lost a fight with an octopus. At this point, the quill was basically retired. It was still used here and there for ceremonial purposes or dramatic flair, but it was no longer practical. Like powdered wigs or swords at weddings, it had become more symbolic than functional. Fountain pens had won the war of convenience. They were sleek, refillable, and didn't involve chasing a goose around your backyard. And just when you thought pens couldn't get any better, along came the ballpoint. In the 1930s, a Hungarian-Argentinian journalist named Laszlo Biro had had enough of smudged ink and leaky fountain pens. He wanted a pen that dried faster, was smoother, and didn't require refilling every time mercury went into retrograde. He invented the ballpoint pen, which uses a tiny metal ball at the tip to roll quick-drying ink onto the page. Game changer. Ballpoints were cheap, reliable, and you could drop them, lose them, or chew on them without causing an ink explosion. They became wildly popular after World War II, especially once companies figured out how to mass-produce them. By the 1950s, the ballpoint had become the dominant writing instrument, officially knocking both quills and fountain pens out of the mainstream. So, to finally answer the question, when did pens replace feathers for writing? The transition started in the early 1800s with the rise of metal dip pens, sped up with the invention of the fountain pen in the late 1800s, and was pretty much complete by the mid-20th century with the ballpoint revolution. Feathers had their day, several centuries of it, actually, but once humans realized they could write without ruffling actual birds, they moved on fast. And if you're wondering whether geese ever got over it, the answer is no. Have you seen a goose lately? They're still mad. If you enjoy this video, or if you think this video was incredible, please like and subscribe. Also, if you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for tuning in, and join us next time here in the channel that answers all the why, what, who, where, and how questions you've always wondered about, here on Explaining Everything.